Everything's changing in the world, and I think we get to see that firsthand in working where we do. Changing so much, I don't think I've never met anyone who contemplates truly what the Asia century is doing or what digital is doing. And we've been doing a lot of sort of side meetings in the last 2 days, and the iPhone was invented, Lee, in 2007, and now it's just so ubiquitous in our lives that most of you are probably on it already as we speak. So just what's happening to us is just incredible. What's happening to our kids, what's happening to us as humans, we just can't imagine. And then you throw in the change of Asia and the rise of China and the rise of Southeast Asia. I just think it's so unbelievable, and we've got to contextualise everything particularly in those two issues, in digital and the rise of Asia. So I often say in my business that if I don't mention digital and Asia in the first 5 minutes, I'm not relevant at all to anybody. So there you go, Lee, I've already done it. So when we wrote Talking 2030 for the NFF, we did not want to write a fluffy sort of principles or values-based policy paper. We actually wanted to get down and dirty and get real issues on paper, so we actually decided not to write a sort of a traditional approach to it, Lee. We went and got about 30 experts and got people who we thought were really interesting, cutting-edge type people. So we took quite a different approach. So if you haven't read it, please do it, and you'll really enjoy it. So that's the approach we took, and the NFF subsequently took those sort of 30 cutting issues, took them out to their members, and they've developed the roadmap, which many of you have seen. So I went back and had a look at it 12 months hence and just said, well, righto, let's pick out some things that have policy dilemmas, I think. And there are a lot of policy dilemmas in ag, and that's good. But there's things we just have to keep working on. The key themes were really obvious, and writing strategies for industries is almost too easy in a way, because the same issues almost always appear. So, and we can give 20 talks. 20 people could come up and give talks, so we'd all have the same issues. So it's not so much what the issues are, it's what you do about them is, I think, far more to the point. But we all know what the issues are. Every one of you in this room could give the same talk as me. So I just picked a few out. So I just wanted to chat to you about a few of them. Energy policy is a newish one. I mean, when I started running factories and stuff like that about 10 years ago, actually energy was a competitive advantage. How quickly that changed, and how quickly we turned a competitive advantage, we sort of stuffed it up really, I suppose, in terms of energy policy. So that's one that's still, I think, unresolved. And again, I'm not being critical about anyone when I say these things, but yeah, the cost of energy, particularly manufacturing, not as much on farm, but particularly in the supply chain, energy policy is obviously a dilemma, and we're going to have to make some hard choices because the cost of energy, and particularly how you have base load, is obviously in conflict with what we're trying to do with reducing our emissions. So we'd all love to go to renewables 100% tomorrow, but obviously the dilemma of base load starts to present itself. So I know the food manufacturers are particularly worried about energy costs because it's turned into a competitive disadvantage. Emissions reduction, I went through the CPRS RUD years, and the carbon pricing sort of was well on the agenda then, Lee, in 2007, 2008. The sector quickly got exempted in terms of emissions from livestock, but that debate will not go away. That's going to still be there. And in Talking 2030, Michelle Allen wrote about carbon neutrality for the meat sector. So these are, again, huge policy choices about how do you make sure that you can grow productivity in the meat sector and move towards carbon neutrality. So good on them. That's a very brave stance to take in a sector like meat. I thought Senator Colbeck answered your question on climate risk in fisheries really well. You know, he talked about mitigation, which is not talked about enough. You know, he didn't say, oh, it's not going to happen, Lee. He said, no, we've got to learn how to deal with that issue. So, and that's true with climate risk. I think most studies would show that we are pretty capable of mitigating climate risk, but you know, obviously we need the skilled practitioners on the farm to do that. I'll come back to this market products one. I won't talk about drought policy. There's a whole section on that. Water was mentioned yesterday. My concern about the Murray-Darling Basin, and in my past life I also went through that process too when Malcolm Turnbull was Water Minister back in 05 and 06. And my concern is that every time we get a drought, inevitably every 10 years or so we get a drought, we essentially re-prosecute the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. And as a Northern Victorian irrigator, that's pretty frustrating because you get that sort of uneasy feeling of uncertainty all the time. So I think Minister Littleproud kind of answered that one pretty well yesterday as well, that you've got to try and get bipartisanship, as tough as that is. But it's pretty... I just get really frustrated by re-prosecuting the Murray-Darling Basin Plan every time there's a drought. So that's one that worries me. Can we ever build a new dam in Australia? Tassie's the only place basically in the last 30, 40 years where we've built new storage. We know about Hell's Gate up in Toowoomba, for example, where I think it looks like it's a necessary asset, but can we just get over that? I'm not sure we can. It's a policy dilemma. It's a tough choice to, by definition, can we increase the size of our storages and do that in a sustainable way? I'm not saying I know the easy answers to this. Stock water is one that's often forgotten, and especially in places like southern Victoria where higher rainfall meant that some of those sort of systems were farm dam based, and the provision of stock water was just taken for granted, whereas now we see some of the droughts, 06 and for example, where some of those regions like parts of Gippsland, Western Victoria ran out of stock water, and nothing shuts down a sector faster than running out of stock water. So just another little tip, one to look at. I'm not sure water markets are working properly yet. I think the jury's definitely still out on the connected southern basin, and I just still think there's some policy choices, Lee, to make around the operation of effective water markets. Again, when it's wet, it's not an issue, but as soon as the drought comes along, the provision of effective markets is critical. And digital is, the monitoring of our systems using digital is an absolute no-brainer. All of our water systems should be IoT connected sooner rather than later. There's a lot of controversy, as you know, about monitoring water in the Murray-Darling Basin in particular, and we have digital solutions now that should be being used. So that's an absolute no-brainer. I'm not going to go back over R&D too much, but my big issue with R&D is that it is going to get massively disrupted. And I kind of, coming back to how I opened my talk, there's nothing more certain that we'll get disrupted the same way as the taxi industry has, and the travel industry has, and the hotels industry, and the retail sector. We will get disrupted. It hasn't happened a lot to ag yet, Lee, but we will get disrupted by digital, and we'll get disrupted by venture capital, and we'll get disrupted, just like every other sector. It's starting to happen now, I think, in R&D, where venture capital. So the example I use, I think it's right. 4 or 5 geneticists in the US started their own company, got some IP. Based on CRISPR technology, went out, they raised $75 million through venture capital and started essentially their own R&D company based on IP generation. Now that was the role of government and institutions until recently, but now I think the world is going to move into whole new models of generating IP. And if we sit there and watch that happen, then we're just, before we know it, we're going to become irrelevant. And so all of that debate you heard yesterday about where the future of the world is going, well, you do something about it or else it'll just happen to you. We don't want to be the taxi industry sitting there watching Uber come into our lives, and how easy it was for Uber to disrupt taxis. So, I know it's a long bow I'm drawing, but we don't want to be so easily disruptable by just sitting there doing nothing. I won't go into that. The other one I just wanted to mention briefly, because it's a passion of mine, is the new breeding technologies. I did mention CRISPR in passing there. So forage is at the heart of everything, and particularly both animals and plants sectors. We need to make sure that the policy settings around the new breeding technologies are sound and give us that option, Lee. It's a critical one. Still not resolved as we stand here today. Digital, I think, has been done to death anyway, but I'll just make a couple of points on digital. It's going to dramatically change the way we do things. But I often talk about, I was with the Commonwealth Bank briefly at Brekkie yesterday, and I said they changed my life. When I was running our farms, I used to sit down once a month and write. I know Georgie will kill me for telling the story again, but I used to write 40 cheques and lick 40 stamps and write 40 envelopes, and that used to take me, I don't know, about 5 hours to do that work every month. When NetBank came along, that cut that time down to an hour. So NetBank gave me 4 hours back every month, so 48 hours. So I think that's about eight probably working days that one little technology gave me back as a person. So even if you said, right, everything we do now, administratively, compliance-wise, for example, if we said we can halve that time, just taking digital, applying it to all the things we do on our farm just to save time. So not even any new, we're not doing anything newly, is my point. We're just doing what we do now, but do it quicker. That is as simple as how digital can change our lives. So that's kind of my mantra. Just let's look at everything we do, let's do it faster, do it more efficiently, and let digital transform our lives, particularly with things like compliance. When you start doing that, it'll just open up a whole new world for us in terms of consumer story and look through to customer, for example. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I think Emma might be better to cover people. But one of the things that came out in Talking 2030 far stronger than probably other reports is the access to services in regional Australia, so childcare, health, education, and there's a story in Talking 2030 about the fact that people who want to go back to work and how hard it is to get childcare, for example. So our second and third tier regional country towns, I think, is still a bit of a policy gap, not something that doesn't get talked about enough. Like the big country towns are fine, the big country cities, of 20, 30, 50, 100,000 people, but the ones, that next level down, that sort of 5,000 people city, country town, or that 1,000 people country town, I think that's still a big policy gap. I think this is my last slide. So the biggest issue for me, I've been asked a lot of times on Talking 2030, what's the biggest issue to get to the 100 billion? To me, it's definitely risk and capital. So at the moment, we have the terrible twosome of market volatility and climate volatility. And every now and then, about every fourth or fifth year, Lee, they line up. And when they line up, it's literally like one step forward, 3 or 4 steps back. And people don't like investing in ag because of this. And so the Australian super funds, notoriously low investors in ag. Now, if you looked at New Zealand, for example, and you compared the New Zealand dairy sector to the Australian dairy sector, well, it rains very regularly in New Zealand, and the volatility, they essentially still have all the market volatility we have, but they don't have the climate volatility we have. So we have to try and start to find structures Lee, to reduce risk. You can't change the weather, but our market structures are a lot of them are old. They're 60s, 70s market structures. As products start to get value added, as products start to get scarcer, there's going to be many more opportunities to start to vertically integrate the chain more. That doesn't mean companies necessarily owning the whole chain, but the backing of contracts, the more security and certainty of supply in contracts, that's definitely going to have to happen. It's starting to happen now. If it doesn't happen, then we just will not attract capital, Lee. You know, if we just continue to have volatility of returns like we've got now, we won't attract the capital we need. So we need fundamentally new market structures. So if you look at beef, for example, you're going to move into the boxed beef markets in countries like China. They're going to sort of decommoditise. They'll start to line up with retailers and distributors. And I spoke to people even as recently as yesterday where they are now saying, Robert, you have to help me get back through the chain and contract supply back through the chain. Because there's Asian users, Asian customers who just can't get our products anymore. So, you know, we've got this interesting concept of value adding, scarcity. Senator Colbeck kind of touched on it in Hort. And so there's sort of structured chains. In the report, I'd recommend you have a look at the New Zealand merino industry, because they had a market-based, you know, go to auction, sell it to whoever. It was actually destroying the sector. So they went into the Italian soup makers and the spinners, and they said, if you want New Zealand wool, you're going to actually have to back us in. Otherwise, the whole industry is going to disappear. So they actually went into their markets, and they now buy. That company started with, I think, about 3 wool growers, and they now buy 75% of the wool in New Zealand. A really good example of what I'm talking about. I think that's it. Hand over. Happy to please ask some questions. Let's get some good discussion going. Thank you, Lee.